Hi everyone and welcome. This is an example of what we're going to be making today. I call it a cherry blossom branch necklace, and you can see why. What I'm basically doing is using a selection of complementary coloured beads ranging from white to pink to red to really create that changing cherry blossom effect. What we're going to need to create that necklace is about 8 inches or 20 centimetres of 20 gauge wire. We're going to use that to create our branch. We're going to need about 10 inches of 28 gauge wire. And we're going to need about 5 centimetres or 2 inches of 24 gauge wire. And we're going to use that wire to attach our necklace to our chain. And you'll also need a necklace chain. And in terms of tools, we just need some wire cutters and pliers. Alright, so let's get started. With our branch, what I'm going to start by doing is just making a loop in one of the ends. And that's going to be the section that we're going to attach our chain to. Then what I'm going to start doing is creating these rounded sections, these loops in our chain. Now because it's a branch, we don't want it to be completely straight, so if you sort of manipulate it a bit with your fingers as you go along, just to create that sort of waved effect. So all I'm doing is wrapping the wire around my round part of my pliers and then bringing it to the other side. So we create a loop like that. And we don't want it to be completely straight because we want it to look like a branch. So we'll just keep going along, creating our loops in our section. They don't need to be all the same size. And we'll just create another loop just in the end with our pliers so that we can pop our chain into something. Now I'm using a slightly shorter length of wire that I did on the last occasion. This is about 5 inches. Last time I did use about 8 inches. So if you want a longer necklace, then certainly go for a longer, about 8 inches of your 20 gauge wire. Now what we're going to do is attach our 28 gauge wire to our wire frame. We can do that just by wrapping it around a couple of times. So I've wrapped that around 4. And what we want to do is put our beads on the outside of our loop. So I'm going to bring our 28 gauge wire. Now if you want to chop it up, then that's fine. It is a bit easier to deal with shorter lengths of your 28 gauge wire because it can tend to get a bit tangled, and that does get a bit frustrating. So what we'll do is we'll pop our wire into through our loop. Now I'm going to grab one of my beads. So I'm using about 26 beads here. They range between 2mm and 4mm. And I'm using the pinks and the reds and the whites. So what I'm going to do is hold my bead on the top of my loop on the outside, just like that. And then I'm going to wrap my wire around that loop to hold it in place. So I'll just grab my wire and... Now I like to think it keeps in place really well if you do this twice, so I'm going to wrap that around 2 times. Okay, now I'm going to grab another bead, go for a red one this time. And again, I'm just going to hold that on top of the frame and wrap my wire around twice. So just thread it through the loop. I can see the end of my wire is getting a bit in the way, so I'm just going to trim that excess wire off. Okay, so now I'm just going to add another bead. So around each loop I do 3 beads around the outside. So we just wrap that around. And to anchor the last one in place and to hold all these beads in place, it's a good idea with your last one just to wrap the wire around 3 times around the outside of that loop. Okay, so now we've secured the beads around our first loop. We're going to go over to our straight section of our wire. Looks like that one's gotten a little bit tangled, so I'm just going to trim that and to try and fix that up. So you can always re-anchor your wire onto your structure just by wrapping it around a few times. Okay. So now that we're on the straight section of our wire, I'm going to put a loop, or a bead I should say, around on this straight section, because you can see here what we've got happening is beaded loop, bead on our straight section, beaded loop, bead on our straight section. So there's a bit of a pattern happening there. So all I'm going to do is pop it onto our straight section and then wrap the wire around a few times, just twice to make sure it's anchored. Then what I'm going to do is bring my wire over to my next loop. I'm going to anchor it on that loop by wrapping it around a few times. And I'm going to add 3 more beads to that outside section. So again, holding your bead on the top of the loop, wrapping your wire around twice. And then just keep going by wrapping our wire around our metal structure. So what I like to do is every time I finish a loop, I wrap my wire around about 3 times so that I anchor all the beads in really well. Okay, now that we're back to another straight section, we'll wrap our wire around that section a few times, and I'm going to grab another bead to pop on our straight section before we go back to doing our next loop. Okay, and I'll finish off these last 2 loops and then we'll be back to attach the chain in just a moment. Okay, so we finished off just about, so I've just popped the last bead onto our straight section, and to anchor our wire I'm just going to wrap it around 4 times and just trim off any excess. So there's our main sort of structure. As you can see, I've done a smaller one than I have on that occasion. You can certainly make it as large or as small as you want to, just by using a few more materials. What we'll do now is we'll attach our chain to our main structure, and that's where we use our 24 gauge wire. You can use whatever wire you want for that, but I find the 24 gauge really fixes beads together really well. It's not too inflexible, but it will hold its shape. So we're going to start by making a hook shape in our wire, just by bending our pliers around it. Pop that into the loop on one of your structures, and then using your pliers, bend the wire around the straight wire, the long length of the wire, and pull your wire up. So you've got something just like that. Just trim any excess wire off. Now I'm going to use a 4mm bead. I'm just going to thread that onto my wire, and we're going to wrap the top of this, but before we do we're going to pop the chain in there, and we do that so we don't have to worry about soldering or anything like that. So grab your wires about 1 centimetre, 1/4 of an inch less above from the bead, bend the wire down so that you've got that hook in there. Now if I take the pliers out, you can see we've got a bend in the top of our bead, and what you need to do is just thread your wire through your necklace chain into one of the links in the necklace chain. And it's a good idea to use a soldered necklace chain for this if you want your design to last really well. Now with your long length of the wire, once your chain is in that loop, bend that wire down and wrap it around the smaller length of the wire a couple of times, just like that. Okay, and then trim your excess wire. Now what we need to do is add our other side of the chain. What you could do I've just used a length of chain which is big enough to fit over my head, but if you wanted to, you could cut that in half and pop a little lobster clasp or something like that in there, using the same technique that we're using to fit our beads onto the chain in the first place. Okay, so we'll do the same thing with the other side. We'll just put a bend in our wire, thread that through onto our loop, and wrap a loop around. So we've attached our 24 gauge wire to our main structure. Trim that excess bit of wire, pull it straight. Take one of our 4mm beads. You could use a smaller bead if you want, but I think it creates a bit of balance using a bigger bead. Put a loop in the top of that bead, just like that. Grab the other end of your chain, and thread the chain through that loop before you close off that loop. So you can see we're just wrapping the longer length of our wire towards our bead. And then you just trim off any excess wire. Okay, and there we have it. You certainly don't have to make it a cherry blossom style necklace. You could use whatever colours you want. You can put in whatever loops you want, whatever shape you want your main structure to be. But that's one example. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial.